Welcome to this conversation about the rising power of big tech. It's my pleasure to have you all here. Let me introduce quickly our speakers. So first, Theresa and Josephine Seipp is a postdoctoral researcher at the Institute for Information Law and part of the research team at the AI Media and Democracy Lab. And then Paddy Leerssen is a legal researcher and a postdoctoral researcher at the Institute for Information Law as well at the University of Amsterdam. He is specialized in platform regulation and content moderation with a focus on transparency and data access. My name is Thomas Dodds. I'm an assistant professor in journalism and new media at Leiden University and a faculty associate at the Berman Klein Center for Internet and Society. And today we're going to be talking indeed about the rising power of big tech. We have some brief presentations by our speakers, and then we're going to open the floor to have a conversation with you. If you have questions or comments or anything, please feel free to raise your hands. So first, let me welcome to stage Theresa Seipp for her presentation.
All right. Can you hear me? Yes. Well, thanks for being here, especially after it was postponed last time. So if you signed up last time and you came back again, thank you very much for that. I'm going to present a bit of the research I've done as part of my PhD research, which I finished last year. And if you're interested, there's a QR code. You can scan it if you want to read a bit more about it. And my research focuses specifically on how we can make sure that we have sustainable and independent journalism in times of big tech power. So there are three key questions that I want to address. The first one is, how does big tech power actually affect journalism, and why does it lead to media concentration, and how is that a threat to democracy? Secondly, how do the most recent developments that we all read and hear about all the time around Trump and Musk and others actually endanger European media? And finally, what can Europe do to protect media independence against big tech power? So first of all, looking at the effect of big tech on the media, the elephant in the room here is dependency, namely the dependency of European media on external, non-European, non-journalistic entities, specifically Google, Meta, Microsoft, Amazon, and so on. That means essentially that European media relies on AI systems and technologies and infrastructures built and controlled by US big tech companies. Meaning, because of these developments, of these dependencies, the resources are shifting primarily to big tech companies, meaning we have a concentration of power in the media ecosystem with resources over especially technology, algorithms, data, but also the skill and the knowledge to actually develop these tools with these companies. And these resources are crucial, though, for the media to operate. So if there's a shift in control over these resources, that creates a dependence and hence a potential threat to independence. With these developments also, big tech and platforms have something that we call opinion power, meaning the power to actually influence public and independent opinion formation processes. And that happens by them algorithmically steering news and information. So what do you actually get to see on your smartphones and so on? They influence how newsrooms operate, and they are powerful actors in the media ecosystem at large, meaning, as I already mentioned, they have large economic players, they have control over the technology, and they have a massive lobbying force in Brussels. So what we see is, with these developments, that larger media organizations are trying to level up, are trying to actually compete with these big tech companies. That is obviously not really possible. So what happens is that the largest media organizations are trying to counter the dependence by building own technologies and also by consolidating resources. That means they're starting to acquire smaller media, and because smaller media have often no other opportunity to actually being bought up and merging with large organizations, this leads to another level of concentration. So we have first the concentration of power over resources with big tech, and then we have a concentration in the traditional media ecosystem with larger media organizations buying up small media organizations. And yeah, this leads to a concentrated media and information ecosystem. And why is this a problem? Just to refer back to the normative basis of why we're actually talking about this, is that, as Edwin Baker already wrote about decades ago, dispersal of media power, so the dispersal of power in the media, is essentially the main parameter for any system claiming to be democratic. And media pluralism requires a media ecosystem that also gives space and room for small, local, regional, and community voices to be represented. So what are the more recent developments regarding big tech power? As I already mentioned, big tech has opinion power, and they are capable of algorithmically boosting opinions and accounts on social media, but also to remove others. So a very popular example here is Musk's blocking of accounts, of opposition accounts in Turkey most recently. It's in his interference with European elections, most recently in Germany, where he promoted far-right accounts in support of the AfD, but he's also over the years blocked accounts of critical journalists. And this opinion power also translates, therefore, into political power. But this political power also goes further than that, because big tech can actually influence how policies and laws are made based on their commercial interests. A good example here is, it's not very recent, it's a few years ago, but Australia and Canada both passed laws that forced platforms, big tech companies, to actually pay news organizations for the content they're monetizing. And in response to that, Meta blocked all access to their platforms until they actually forced the Australian government, in that case, to renegotiate the laws. And what we see now, and I think that is the big problem, the elephant in the room, is that this merger of tech power, big tech power with state power, so big tech and the White House meddling together, has severe implications for the rule of law and democracy, because they can push for deregulation of the tech sector, they can influence global AI governance, and that can lead to political blackmailing. An example of this is when J.D. Vance threatened to leave the US would leave the NATO if the EU actually tried to enforce the digital laws against X. So what can the EU do? As I already said, there are laws in place, the Digital Services Act, Digital Markets Act most recently, but they actually need to be enforced properly. And very recently, a few weeks ago, the EU actually passed fines against Apple and Meta for 200 million, 500 million euros. It sounds a lot, but it's actually not that much, because it still stays a lot lower than what would be possible under the DMA, where they can actually pass fines of up to 10% of their global turnover. And this is, some argue also, or some criticize, this is also as like backing away from actually taking a stronger stance and not to get too fighty with the US. So what is needed is a political willingness in the EU to actually enforce these hard laws. And a second point, I'm not going to go into too much detail of it because of time, but there's also a need for the EU to actually invest in alternative media communication infrastructures. So a last point that I want to raise, this is my topic that's closest to my heart, is the creation of what I call a journalistic counterpower. And after Trump was elected, Elon Musk tweeted, "You are the media now," to the X community. And what he's completely undermining here is the media's democratic function that has existed forever. So they have a function to actually inform the public, ensure accuracy, and scrutinize power, and also scrutinize the power of these very platforms. So what's needed here is more sustainable funding and business models for an independent media. We need stronger journalistic collaborations, and I use the term journalistic intentionally here because it's not just about the news media, news organizations, but it's also about civil society, NGO, research, academia, and so on. And finally, the media also has a responsibility. They also need to question who are they relying on, who are they entering into deals with, who are their so-called partners, who is funding them, where does the money actually come from? And an example here is The Guardian, when, I don't know when exactly it was actually, but when Musk first, I think, took over X, they stopped using X as their platform for news distribution, claiming that they cannot rely on a platform that actually spreads disinformation and conspiracy theories. So, in a nutshell, what I wanted to say is big tech has opinion and political power, and this is a massive problem when you actually want to regulate them and enforce laws against them. And the second biggest problem is that there are severe dependencies on the infrastructure, and the media cannot function independently if they're dependent on an infrastructure controlled by foreign companies that are very close to the White House at the moment. Yeah, and I mentioned the other points already. Thank you very much.
All right, good evening, everyone. My name is Paddy Leerssen. I'm a researcher here at the Institute for Information Law as well, and I'm specialized in platform regulation. What I'm going to talk about today is, I think, very much related to Theresa's PhD work as well. But whereas Theresa was focusing on really the relationship between platforms and the media and the power they have in the media ecosystem, I'm going to talk about their relationship to states, right? And that's, of course, a big topic, because states have all sorts of different relationships with platforms. And my specialty is in one specific domain. So states relate to platforms in all sorts of ways. They do taxation, right? They regulate labor. They regulate competition, consumer protection. You know, there's countless topics you can talk about when we talk about platform regulation. The housing crisis in Amsterdam is some ways with Airbnb about platform regulation, and so is Uber, right? So there are all these different domains we can talk about. I'm focused on content regulation and social media, so how we govern public expression. And that is, of course, something that's increasingly decided not by conventional laws or just by the media, but by platforms and their rules. So another way of thinking about my topic of content moderation is that we're talking about the expression that isn't taking place via the traditional channels of the media, via television or via radio, but all these alternative forms of well, we can call it news or journalism. People disagree, right? When Joe Rogan reaches millions of viewers via his podcasts on YouTube, or any of the other influencers we might like to talk about. So that is my domain, and that is, of course, a topic where states are increasingly active. And I'm going to try to characterize what I see as the different dynamics between the US here and the EU. Once, broadly speaking, of oligarchy versus technocracy. Neither is great. I'm not sure I have an optimistic or constructive message at the end, but I think we can have an interesting discussion about what opportunities or risks we see in both. So to kick things off, let's talk about the vibe shift, as some people are calling it. Have you felt it? The vibe shift? People are saying there are different vibes. And that can be a bit of an abstract or political zeitgeist discussion, but it has some very concrete instantiations. The one I'm most interested in is Mark Zuckerberg in January announcing these quite radical changes to the content moderation, the topic I'm interested in, right? With the headline, "More Speech and Fewer Mistakes." The vibe shift is even visible in him as a person, right? With the different clothes he's wearing and stuff. There's a whole cultural change, I think, social or political and cultural change happening in Silicon Valley at the moment, where these guys are taking on a much more Trump-friendly US conservative course. And I can't really go through all the different policy changes he announced. Some of it's quite complicated. The headline they really led with is we're going to stop with our fact-checking partnerships. And like X, we're going to do community notes instead, where users kind of fact-check each other, right? I will note that there were other things as well, which I think they anticipated that the fact-checking thing would be the most welcome to at least many conservative ears and the least of a PR risk compared to the other stuff they're announcing, like radically reducing how many staff they have doing content moderation and radically allowing more hate speech to occur on the platform, right? Really violent language against LGBTs or other minorities. These are less headline-grabbing, PR-savvy things than the fact-checking that they focused on. So how to make sense of a development like this? I think states are very much in the background here, because, or even in the forefront, because Mark Zuckerberg himself also, in his video where he's talking about this, the policy announcement is about the US, but at the same time, he's hurling all sorts of invective at the EU, where they're saying the EU has these laws that are institutionalizing censorship and making it very difficult to build anything innovative. And he's going to work with the Trump White House to counteract those regulations. That's the plan. So we see already here the kind of allegiance with Trump and the hostility towards the EU and its laws. And I think it's increasingly obvious that there is an oligarchical situation emerging in the US. What do we mean by that? Oligarchy isn't just wealth inequality. Wealth inequality is a condition for oligarchy, but we've had wealth inequality at a staggering pace in the US for a long time now. Oligarchy, according to most definitions, is when that wealth is then leveraged by those wealthy actors to use the political system of that country in a way to preserve or to defend that wealth. And that is a kind of alliance increasingly in the open we're seeing happen between Trump and the US Republicans on the one hand, and Silicon Valley tech CEOs on the other hand. So what are they getting out of this? I think on the US Republican side, that isn't really the focus of today. I would say, first of all, that their claims to defend free speech are totally hypocritical and inconsistent. Right? What they're really saying when they talk about free speech is free speech for US Republicans. Right? Because there are all sorts of ways in which Republicans are very aggressively attacking the speech of those they disagree with and using the force of the state to do so. Such as Donald Trump himself doing multiple lawsuits against media organizations in the US on totally spurious grounds. The banning of books from school libraries because they disagree with what they say. The deportation of pro-Palestine activists. The list goes on quite a long time. So I think to anyone who's really closely following what the Republicans are doing rather than what they're saying, these free speech claims don't really stand up to scrutiny. Clearly they have figured out that talking about free speech in a certain way, broadly, let's call it this anti-woke way, is a way for them to gain votes, or at least to rally up their base. So that's what I think the Republicans are getting out of it, as well as, of course, a set of very wealthy donors. Right? We're seeing consistently that all these parties are donating heavily to the Republican campaigns. What then are the platforms getting out of it? So I think the most convincing critiques for me, there's often in these discussions a question of, are these guys doing it because they really believe in it, or because they have other motives? There's an overlap between these things in practice. So on the one hand, I do believe that someone like Elon Musk believes much of what he's saying when he says, we want to, radically change this. And one thing he has said is, I'm not taking over X as a way to make money. I'm doing it to make a platform for free speech. And in a certain sense, I think that's true, because he's totally ruined the finances of the company in the process, and he is losing a lot of money over this. So there are ways in which that is plausible. And I wouldn't be surprised if Mark Zuckerberg genuinely believes that, the political correctness has gone too far, and he's maybe pretty tired after eight years of negative headlines that it's had to get a change in the company. So there is maybe some genuine kind of conviction there, but there are also very clear political economic drivers. So in the case of Musk, I think it's very interesting to note that while he's losing money on X, in the long term, it might be a very lucrative political bargain for him, because his real wealth and his real economic interest isn't in his ownership of X. Compared to his other holdings, some of the largest companies in the world, X is very small. But it's SpaceX and it's Tesla that are gigantic, and in fact heavily dependent on subsidies from the US and from other states, specifically though from the US. So is this a way of brokering an alliance with the White House? A way for him to secure those holdings for which, the acquisition or the losses at X are a pretty small price to pay, right? In the case of Zuckerberg, I note that he argues against, free speech and censorship laws in the EU, which I'll discuss in a minute. But at the same time, he's talking about all these other EU laws, the ones which I think really threaten his business, the ones that are about competition law reform. Can they acquire all sorts of startups, or what kind of prices can they set for their advertisers? Laws related to privacy and the collection of user data, which their businesses thrive on. right? So you see in his rhetoric the constant conflation of these things. You really, really care about censorship, so let's get rid of all these EU laws. So that's where my estimation is of his economic interests in this bargain. More broadly, though, as I think maybe an academic or theoretical point, I think this points to the idea that to understand what's happening in big tech, we need to be looking at a few very specific individuals, these owners. And I would use the term moguls, much like we talked about media moguls in the past, like Rupert Murdoch, for instance, and these actors that are very strategically engaging in alliances with governments and politicians in ways that are partially economic and partially political, and often an overlap of the two. What's notably different about this new scenario, though, is that these moguls are globally or transnationally active. It used to be that more or less each country had its own set of oligarchs or media barons with different political constellations, but suddenly we're confronted with a situation where there's really only one game in town. And Europe has to deal with the fact that these aren't our oligarchs. And that's not to say that's not to idealize our past media ecosystems, but it's to note, I think, a shift in their scale. So that's so much for the EU ecosystem. Yeah, one more thing I'll note here is that this isn't to say, of course, that the US isn't regulating platforms. I think that would be a big mistake. They just don't do it via laws. This is kind of part and parcel of the oligarchical arrangement they have. So the only time we had a real law, serious proposal come out in the last few years from the US was to ban TikTok. And it's lay dormant for a few years until after October 7th and the start of the genocide in Gaza, it came back to life again. And they wouldn't readily admit it, most of it, until Mitt Romney did, that, well, really the reason we're banning TikTok is because pro-Palestine content is very, very popular and we can't get them to get rid of it. Facebook, the domestic platforms, were quite willing to heavily censor pro-Palestine content. And TikTok wasn't to the same degree, so they get banned. That was the plan anyway. Now we see the TikTok CEO showing up at the Trump inauguration, and sometime in the last few months they started taking a much more aggressive line against Palestinian content. Right? So it really would be a mistake to think that the US isn't regulating platforms, it's just through very different means. Right? And I think the lesson they have learned is that they need to be our oligarchs, they need to be in our countries. Really, the demand of the TikTok ban wasn't to prohibit the app, it was to force them to divest to US owners. They really wanted Elon Musk to buy it, right? So again, that analysis of oligarchy, I think, should be central. Now, I've been speaking for a while, so I'll be a bit briefer here, but let's contrast that with the EU situation, where we are kind of doing, let's say, the old school thing of just writing laws, right, and trying to get companies to comply in that way. So there are all these different laws. I already mentioned some that are being written. Even for us experts, it's kind of hard to keep up with this endless barrage of different laws that are being written, starting with the GDPR almost 10 years ago now. That's a privacy law, right? How they collect data about users. The two real pillars are the DMA, which is about fair competition, and the fines that Theresa talked about are based on the DMA. So how can you acquire different apps or set rules to engage with cross-ownership of apps, these kinds of things. Whereas the DSA, the law I'm specialized in, is about, what should a platform do with misinformation or hate speech or, all these other content categories. And there are many, many other more I could mention. Now, the reason I'm calling this a technocratic approach is because we don't see, I think, very strong political choices in these laws. There is a broad kind of commitment to evidence-based policy making and to accountability, but not really the willingness to take very strong stances on certain questions. So, for instance, in the DMA, right, which is about, let's say, breaking up the economic power of big tech, we see laws that, the prices that the platforms shed should be fair, and they shouldn't abuse their dominance by setting overly monopolistic prices. And that gets you into a very complex economic discussion about, what is the fair price actually? What they weren't willing to do is say we're going to break up these companies because we think that's the right thing to do. Right? There is a world, 60 years ago in the US we had monopolies for telecommunications, and they broke them up, and they said, if you own the telecoms lines, you can't also own the company that sells the telephone boxes. Right? And you could imagine something like that being proposed, and that's not the kind of step they're willing to take. So let's say Amazon, for instance, being a retail platform, but also selling their own products on that platform is something that they weren't willing to kind of cut up in that way. So that's an example there. When it comes to the DSA, the technocratic approach, I think, is reflected in the fact that whenever a journalist asks me, does the DSA require this, I say, well, I don't really know. So, for instance, fact-checking was the most recent one, right? Does the DSA require fact-checking? We don't really know. The requirement is that platforms need to do an analysis based on the best available evidence and expertise of what risks are on their platform, and then to take appropriate measures to analyze them. So what does that mean, right? It becomes technocratic in the sense that it's a rule by experts. So the Commission has its experts, academics try to get involved with their own research, and the platforms have a whole bunch of experts of their own, and usually a lot more data than we do to actually make the arguments that their approach really is the best. So what I mentioned at the start, that Mark Zuckerberg says there are too many mistakes being made in the fact-checking, right? I'd be really curious to see the evidence for that. I don't think there's a kind of really rigorous risk assessment that the DSA would require for like underpinning that. In fact, I was in Brussels yesterday. I took this picture yesterday when I was in Brussels. It was a workshop by the Commission talking about, the future of those kind of risk assessments under the DSA. And it was kind of interesting to talk about these things because, when you read the reports that the platforms are putting out here, they're saying, this is all the stuff we're doing and it's going so brilliantly, and look at this wonderful fact-checking program we've designed. So when you look at those reports, you actually see a very different narrative. So if there is some kind of optimism I can cast here, it's that slowly but surely, these processes, this kind of slow boring of hard bores, we can get more and more evidence, and platforms in the EU, like Zuckerberg, hasn't yet abandoned the fact-checking. And in fact, to do that, to take such a radical change, he would have to supply very serious evidence, totally contradicting the evidence he has produced so far, to say that fact-checking is in fact problematic, because the evidence they've supplied so far says it's working pretty well. So that's kind of how I would characterize the situation in the EU, of kind of a slow, deliberate, evidence-based thing where I would say committing yourself to a very rigorous evidence-based policymaking can actually set your burdens of proof so high that you're never really going to outsmart these platforms. So I think that's the challenge we face. I think I'll leave it there for now. Thanks. Well, this is a nice picture now.
Thank you very much. I'll open the floor for questions in a second. I have a couple myself. They're very easy. I'm not a lawyer, much to my mother's chagrin. So I'm wondering if you could help me ground some of these ideas, maybe with examples. I don't know if there's any journalists in the audience. No, great. But Theresa, for you, you talk about the need for counterpower, and I'm wondering how counterpower looks in practice. So basically, what can newsrooms and journalists do in order to defend themselves against the predatory power that a lot of these platforms are trying to put into media organizations and trying to make them dependent for journalists? So how does counterpower look in practice? What is actually something that newsrooms can do to defend themselves?
Great question, thank you. Well, I hinted to it in my presentation that one part of doing that is actually to collaborate. So in my current research, I look at how local newsrooms implement AI into their processes. And local newsrooms are obviously, in comparison to DPG Media or the BBC, quite understaffed. That they don't have the knowledge and the tools and the skills in-house to actually develop own technologies, or to even really create a strategy to counter this dependence. So there are some initiatives, for instance, to enable data sharing between local news organizations that will make it easier for them to understand what's going on, and also to develop own tools. So DPG Media, for instance, or larger organizations, they started creating own tracking technologies so they can actually collect their own data, which local and small regional organizations can't do. But there are also some examples already of media organizations to, let's say, diversify the dependencies. So I don't have a percentage at the top of my head right now, but a large majority of European media organizations use AWS cloud infrastructure to store their data. So if you look at this dependence, it's quite severe, and there's also a lot of sensitive data stored on these infrastructures. So some media organizations are starting to at least store sensitive data more on local infrastructures. That is one aspect. Then a more European initiative to actually enable it. It's quite recent, so it's still a bit debatable how effective it really is the European media data spaces that would create a more structured and systemized approach to enable these sharing collaborations and so on. But just to point out also, because there's also a lot of criticism regarding these content sharing hubs. So what also a lot of media organizations started doing is to basically one media company writes an article, and the same article is just reused for different regions, and then you sort of lose the context in the local context. And often to create trust in the media and in journalism, it's really relevant that local communities also actually get information and news from what's going on in their local communities. That means you can have these ways of like collaborate and share data and all of that, but you can't overcome the need to actually still be in the local place. Sorry, I talked too much.
No, that was great. I mean, it is super important because we did a little bit of research we mapped all the hyperlocal newsrooms in South Holland, so all the town newspapers that are very common still in the Netherlands. And what we found is that as soon as they get bought by a big conglomerate, the first thing that happens is that their agenda changes from local content to more regional content. So indeed, kind of that's a big challenge that they're dealing with. Paddy, for you have talked about in the past about European alternatives to this problem, to creating local alternatives to kind of these platforms, to the systems. How will that look like?
Yeah, thanks. I think that was the point I wanted to talk about until I ran out of time. So that's a perfect question. Again, this is not really the core of my research, but it's a kind of topic you inevitably run up against. Broadly speaking, I would say there are three different ways of regulating. The DSA is we have these big platforms, let's make them behave better. The DMA is let's try to minimize their power and to break up, have an ecosystem of smaller private platforms. And the third one is let's build our own platforms. And maybe those are publicly owned or some kind of non-profit structures. And the most inspirational model for me is still like public broadcasting, right? Can you have a little omroepen stelsel? I mean, that has its own problems for the Dutch people in the room, God knows. But there are ways of creating there's this distinction between public media and state media. Like some people reflexively think, if the government does it, it's censorship. But like we have all these wonderful traditions we could look back to there. There is, however, a fundamental problem with adapting that model to the internet, which is, again, that transnational scope, right? I totally disagree with Mark Zuckerberg and many, many other people who argue that the reason we don't have European champions, as they call them in Brussels, in the area of tech, is because of our dang laws, because they make it so hard to do anything innovative. I think it's a fundamental fact of geography and culture, or demography, let's say. It's easy to forget, in 2005, every country in Europe had its own social media platform. I don't know how many of you had a Hives account back in the day. I see some hands up, right? And, there was Bebo in Ireland, and I forget what the German one was called, but, sorry? Lokalisten, right, there you go. And was Facebook fundamentally more innovative than them, or is it just the US is a much bigger country and everyone speaks English, so that when we all turned 12 and we started having our first friends on holidays, we go to Facebook? And I think that's what we call network effects in an economic sense. And this is a fundamental fact, which means that they just have a leg up. And the only other country that's done this is China, right? Is China more innovative than Korea or Japan? Russia is arguably has their own kind of ecosystem, right? But these are very large countries with very large language groups. So all this to say that this is still a major challenge if we want to have idea of doing platforms on our own. Some people say this is the idea of the Euro stack, right? where you start at other levels, like they call it a technology stack. If you do internet communications, you just don't need a website. You need like servers, you need pipes, you need like operating systems, you need word processors, all these other things that you need, right? And that we start at lower levels. I'm not sure we resolve all these really controversial issues of like freedom of expression or disinformation if we own the servers that they run on. So yeah, I'm not sure there is a really a clear solution there. The thing that interests me the most at the moment are kind of more public interest or non-profit models like Blue Sky, right? Where you have a serious talk about who owns it, governance structures behind it, without necessarily making that into like a European project. Yeah.
That's interesting. Thank you very much to both of you. I'm going to open the floor. If there's any question, there's a mic going around. I think there's a question there. And the mic is coming to you. Eventually. You have a question?
Thank you very much for all the information you gave us. What I'm thinking about is, isn't the DSA more or less a paper tiger, actually?
So the short answer is no. This law is really doing things. So the Commission, I would say it's a slow process, right? So I'm serious, like this is going to take 10 years before we really see these things come into fruition.
So in that sense, it's a paper tiger.
No, there are many very serious developments in society that take a long time to manifest, right? So the Dutch regulator was only appointed 2 months ago officially, and now they're taking all sorts of steps that were taken in Germany a year ago. Platforms have already done major changes to their policy, which either explicitly or implicitly are tied to the DSA. So I wouldn't say it's a paper tiger, no. But you can say that the choices that were made were less radical or ambitious than some people would have liked them to be.
And another question is about the technical infrastructure. We all know that they indeed used AWS, etc. Almost all of them are being owned by American companies. But what not many people know is that even all the routers who are in it are also owned by American companies. And they have backdoors. All those routers have backdoors. So they could implement a kill switch with no problem in all those routers, meaning that we could be without any communication if they want to. Are there any thoughts about that?
So if I understand your question correctly, it's a concern that, let's say, U.S. intelligence would install malware or kill switch or these kind of things in the infrastructure in other countries.
Yeah, it's in the router. It's in the routers in all those data centers. Mm-hmm. It's not the routers you have at home. It's in the routers at the data centers. They're all from 2 or 3 companies, but they're all American companies.
Yeah, I think that's a very real concern. Yeah, and that's where you get into a different part of the tech sovereignty debate, where all this critical infrastructure like hosting and telecommunications has these elements that, to my understanding, more and more we have these virtualization developments where things that used to be just dumb pipes are now software driven and more open to kind of these kind of vulnerabilities. So I think that's a very good point. That's not necessarily the core of my research, but these are definitely concerns. So there is this. I think it's useful to think of this stack, right, for the general audience as this idea that whenever you're doing internet communications, you're relying not just on 1 or 2 intermediary parties, but this whole kind of pile of them, this stack, right? And all along that stack, there are different vulnerabilities. The fundamental challenge, I think, is that we have the lower levels, really what we'd call infrastructure, things that everyone needs, that need to treat us more or less neutrally. And access to them is totally critical. Like if they get shut down, it becomes like a major societal crisis. At the higher level of stacks, however, we want these services to discriminate. Like that's exactly the kind of challenges we see with something like the DSA, where if you have platforms like social media platforms that don't constantly decide who gets to go in and to shut people out to do content moderation, it comes flooded with Viagra advertising and Bitcoin scams within 2 days. So there are certain levels of the stack that need to be really critical, like secured and like universally open, like the roads or the internet pipes, and there are others where the whole topic is who gets to decide and how on what gets shut out.
Thank you very much for your question. I think we have another one here.
Thank you so much for the introductions. Both speakers talked about oligarchy and oligarchic structures and so on. That's one dimension of the arena. The other one, the second dimension of the arena, oligopoly, was not mentioned at all. There is a more or less soulmate relationship between oligarchy and oligopoly. But could you tell more about the way in which not the internal discipline by oligarchy, but the external discipline on the market by oligopoly is exactly treated, handled, managed in this way? To make it a little bit less abstract, my question, what do you think that Google, Apple, Microsoft and the likes think about the semi-monopolistic relationship between Trump and Musk? Do you think they just acquiesce, they just comply, they just obey, or something like that? Or do you think that there are subcutaneous movements and strategies in order to reduce the monopolistic marriage between Trump and Musk?
Thank you very much. Any volunteers?
Yeah, I can start. Well, maybe first point, I think Musk seemed quite liberal before, and so did Trump and other big tech owners. So you always have to wonder a bit like, what do they actually want to get out of the closeness to Trump? And I suppose, you know, they see an opportunity there to push for deregulation, to actually enable like stricter laws against them not to be enforced. The Biden administration and Linda Khan specifically, you know, they really pushed against the monopolistic position of Google in the US, for instance. So my first take to your last part of the question is it's very opportunistic in a way. And to your first part, looking, my research focus more on the media ecosystem, media aspects, but you do have something called media concentration law in every country, apart from the Netherlands, actually, more or less. But there are laws in place that actually like make sure that there is no monopolistic power of position of power in the media. And the problem here is that actors like Google or Meta, they're not considered media, so they fall outside the scope of these regulations. There's a new law in the EU called the European Media Freedom Act where they actually try to take this on. So they try to open the scope to actually include platforms and big tech companies in the media concentration assessments. But it's quite difficult because, you know, media laws happen at national level and they're enforced at national level. So the EU can create some guidances and some frameworks and harmonizing frameworks, but the actual media regulation is at the national level. So that makes it also difficult to actually develop a comprehensive EU-wide approach to, or harmonized approach to this problem.
Yeah, if I may, I think these questions of media concentration and how we can start to apply those things to platform regulation as well are interesting but very challenging, because it ties back to the point I was making previously. Ultimately, everyone wants to be on the same platform to a degree. This is the idea of the network effect, right? That there's the idea that on the platform you want to communicate with others, and if they're not on the same platform as you, then it loses some value, right? And this is fundamentally why the idea back in the day that, well, the more TV channels and the more diverse programming we had, the better. That was kind of, I'm simplifying somewhat, but that's kind of one of the values of media pluralism, right? To have the more like diverse platforms we have, there's something very meaningfully lost there. And breaking up the platforms in that way isn't as straightforward as saying we're just going to add a new television channel, right? There are two other ways in which we could think about pluralism, though, within these systems, which is pluralism on the platform, right? Can we mandate, for instance, that certain things should be seen on platforms? This is a development we saw during COVID, right, where credible sources like the WHO gained a certain prominence on the front page of YouTube because we thought that was important information for people to see, right? So we can have a very small number of platforms, and it's still a tremendous diversity of content on the platforms, right? In a way, the content is more diverse than ever in that regard, right? So that's one angle to think of. The other is diversity of the ownership of the platforms. And that's a discussion I'm trying to kind of dig into in one of my new papers, which I think is kind of undervalued and really ties into this point about oligarchy and a very meaningful difference between some of these firms, right? So I don't think it's a surprise that Facebook and X are the two firms that have suddenly changed, because these are the ones who had much the concentrated ownership in a single person. They have these dual-class stock structures, so that one person has more than 60, 70, or I think 90% in the case of Facebook of the voting shares. That's not the case for Microsoft. It's not the case for Apple. They are largely owned by investment firms, and it's much more dispersed. And there's not just one individual that can go up to the White House and like broker a deal and change on a whim how they're going to run the platform, for better and for worse. Like, it's not like BlackRock and Vanguard are going to necessarily be the best stewards of democracy in this space, right? But it is a very meaningful difference between these firms, and looking closely at who owns these firms and how that is concentrated, that control, is another very interesting angle of approach.
Thank you very much. Do we have another question?
Yeah, thanks very much also for the introduction. My question would be basically in an age where we come, as you say, there's kind of a tech oligarchy building and a concentration of power, and also considering that what you say basically that everybody wants to be on the same platform, so that's part of us as well. How do you plan to basically prevent monopolies, or basically looking to the future, how do you break that up and balance the power forthcoming also, especially for the EU?
Yeah.
I'm so happy I'm not answering this question.
Yeah.
It's great.
I mean, that's the elephant in the room, right?
It's a $1 million question, right? I mean, personally, I just think we need to stop using social media. That's kind of like this guy I think we're more like, I'm only half joking, but I feel like we're more and more becoming attentive to very fundamentally the emotional, the psychological, the societal toll that these tools have on us. And overall, the biggest victory, Netflix said a few years ago, our main competitor is sleep. If we can get, and so one tangible victory is if the time spent on the platforms is reduced. So thinking about anti-addiction interventions, anti-usage interventions is the most optimistic thing I can come up with. A more serious answer that other people would give is that there's the idea of interoperability, that you somehow create, almost in the same way that blockchains operate, a set of protocols, or like email is maybe a better example. Nobody necessarily owns those protocols in a way that allows them to control them, but allows everyone to kind of communicate in a certain set of standards. These are the kind of experiments that have been run with something like Mastodon. We just heard, I think, was it the Dutch public broadcaster stopped using Mastodon because they couldn't get any engagement there. I'm not very optimistic that this is the way forward.
Yeah, but still, that's sort of what I hinted to as well with the idea of counterpower. There is a choice also. Every media organization and every individual can also choose what platforms they use. And I think especially public institutions, public media, or also universities, for instance, they have also responsibility in a way which providers they rely on. And if they're against democratic values, or if they're not fulfilling certain minimum standards, then I think it's also the responsibility to switch or give room to Blue Sky, Mastodon, and so on.
Thank you very much. Another question. I see a hand.
I have a question to Theresa. I agree with you that local journalism is very important, and also regional and national ones. But then on the other hand, the funding models are very difficult, I feel like, because subscription revenues are maybe difficult for newspapers. I at least think they don't really go up. And then also the ad revenues are not really increasing, and most of the money goes to the big tech players. So what do you see as viable funding models for journalism?
I mean, you're right, it's a massive problem, and that's also one of the problems why smaller and local and regional media is specifically vulnerable to platform dependence. But there are a lot of new initiatives coming up, like membership-funded local journalism programs, or community-funded, or philanthropic-funded, and so on. You know, there is quite a bit happening in terms of creative funding models, but indeed, you know, one of the reasons why journalism faces such a such massive sustainability challenges is because the entire revenue model is disrupted, the advertisement model and so on. And this has changed over the last few years, but there was a time maybe 8 years ago where a lot of funding for smaller media organizations actually came from Google and Facebook. So the Google News Initiative and the Facebook, what was it called? The Facebook Journalism Fund or something. So in a way, this also led to especially smaller media organizations to build their entire business models around funding from big tech companies. And then suddenly, you know, Facebook and Google were like, okay, this is too much trouble, you know, and moved away from, withdrew a lot of these funding pots. So, so this is, it left them very dependent, and then obviously leaves quite a big hole. And this also drives a lot of smaller media organizations into having to merge with larger organizations, you know. And this is also what I said earlier. This creates this other level of concentration in the traditional media sector, not just in terms of big tech and legacy media, but also within the traditional media sector.
No, yeah, I mean, complementing that, what it's ironic from the situation is that hyperlocal and local news outlets do relatively well when they're independent, relatively well. They're not very big, but they do relatively well when they're independent, and it's in the moment that they transfer ownership to either big conglomerates and they're forced to use a lot of these platforms, that their business model immediately kind of dies a little bit, and that's because villagers or people that used to consume that news outlet feel like the content has go too national or too broad, and so they don't feel represented anymore by the content in a lot of these newspapers. And so getting bought is, in a way, for a lot of hyperlocal newsrooms in the Netherlands, very much a death sentence in that sense. You lose a lot of your community, you lose a lot of your content, and you lose a lot of the ways that you used to make the news. And you lose trust.
And why do the buyers do it if they're killing these things?
Because on paper it sounds like a good business, right? Like you have not dramatically red numbers, you have revenue from local ads, and you have kind of already reach within these communities. So there's a lot of people who think, well, I'm going to buy them, and then what they start doing is they replicate news articles through the entire region. But I don't know, someone who lives in Wassenaar doesn't really care what happens in, another area of South Holland. And so you start losing kind of that engagement with your audience, like fidelity that you used to have with your audience. And then that's when they decide to dismantle these local newsrooms and sell them for parts. On a more happy note, is there another question somewhere? Is there?
So bear with me if it sounds a little incoherent, but as someone who was a journalist for quite some years and started, at the NOS, one of the things that I have witnessed in my own career is very much sort of the move from sort of the money leaking out of the system, so to speak. I was already entering journalism, quite some years ago, but when it was already sort of the warning signs were there of like, this will not be a sustainable model for you to earn a living for quite some time. And that has only grown and grown and grown as time has gone on, and it has gone sort of hand in hand with the growth in sort of more the far-right sentiments that we see across Europe. There's no real denying that state funding, at least for journalistic organizations, seems to go hand in hand with who's at the, if it's left or right in the political system. And I'm wondering if you guys have thought about or have seen and studied if there, are any successful initiatives in more right-wing governments to put money towards these journalistic institutions. Does it exist? Do we have case studies? Or in a time like this, do we really have to focus more on grassroots systems in order to collect the money that is necessary for independent journalistic systems to thrive? I hope this makes sense.
That was a great question to be half-baked. Thank you very much. Any of you?
Very good question. My first impulse would be that indeed, like, grassroots movements are very important now, and yeah, I think that's also to the question about the business models. A lot of what's keeping some small local organizations alive is actually created through the communities around them, you know, that pay memberships, and therefore they're co-owners in a way, like officially they're co-owners, so they feel like they're actually part of keeping their news infrastructure, local news supply alive. That's to that. Your other question, I don't have an answer.
I will say that this sense of, you know, getting into an industry just that it's kind of dying and people doomsaying that there's no future for you there is like, as a Dutch academic, it's relatable in some ways. But yeah, I think there's an interesting question there of, like, you know, what is kind of the BVV or generally the European right-wing vision for media? I mean, I also have questions about what their views are on Trump too, because Trump is very explicit about America first. So if you're a Dutch nationalist, what does that mean for you? How can you be America first as a Dutch nationalist, right? It's very clearly that he's not working in your interests. He's telling you that, right? And relatedly, like, what is their view of then of his closeness to someone like Elon Musk? Is that viable for them? I find that hard to ponder. I think in the short term they see an alliance there. They see, fellow travelers. Yeah, so that's. I don't know as much about as you guys about the actual media ecosystems, but my sense is that, you know, if I were to try and understand the future, I'd look at Budapest, you know, and like that's maybe the vision, you know.
Yeah, because I think that for me, as someone with a journalistic background, I find very often that the questions sort of stop with a more right-wing government about what their vision really is for something like a media landscape. I think because of the automatic assumption that this is something that they do not see to be worth their while, you know, like Thierry Baudet has massively grown his following on platforms like TikTok and Facebook back in the day, and Instagram. And I kind of what I'm maybe looking for also in a research sense that I hope that maybe the UvA could be meaningful in is sort of, can we further interrogate those visions and sort of also maybe see what's viable? What do they see as viable initiatives to maybe do start in, you know, investing in journalism in that way? I don't know.
Maybe to add one more thing, not in the Dutch context, but there is a lot of talk about introducing a digital tax as well at EU level, and to use that money for journalism programs EU-wide. So I don't know exactly how far they're in these discussions, but this is something that a lot of people, you know, kind of figured out. Maybe that's the last resort, to actually like tax the big tech companies properly and then use that money to invest into journalism. But yeah, just to throw another.
We have time. That's very good. Thank you very much, Tere. We have time for one last question.
Thank you very much. Just following on from your very interesting point, I don't have a background in journalism, but it strikes me that at the same time there's been a move of a lot of journalists to tech companies, in large part because of the salaries, I mean purely as an economic model. We've also seen people like the former, very credible, at least formally credible, editor of The Guardian, who is now sitting on the Facebook Oversight Board, for example. A question around what role do you think the simultaneous rise of influencers, which I think you mentioned early on, people like Joe Rogan and others, and particularly from a right-wing perspective, the rise of people like that or influencers on platforms versus what we've seen, you know, the decimation of journalism in many senses. Do you think there is potentially a link there?
Can I answer the first part of that question? So that is a super interesting question, because we are precisely, with the AI Media Democracy Lab, with some colleagues, we're precisely looking at that. I think first it's important to say that this transition from media to private companies is very common in journalism, for better or for worse. It has happened since always. Stera is an example, and that's great. But there is something super interesting happening with tech journalism in particular. So we interview a couple dozen tech journalists in the Netherlands, and tech journalism must be one of the areas that is suffering one of the biggest changes in kind of the role performance of journalism, because tech journalism, with the exception of some very particular news outlets, so like specialized magazines and things like that, tech journalism used to be very much following what's shiny new phone, shiny new camera, whatever was, you know what I mean? Whatever was the coolest gadget. It was very gadget orientated. And what we're seeing now, and it's very, very beneficial for newsrooms, is that tech journalism is really becoming a critical tool to kind of observe all the socio-political processes that are happening with these technologies. And so tech journalists are really are being brought to the table to, for example, the conversation about how we should adopt AI inside the newsroom. Tech journalists are the ones that are also kind of embedded into that conversation and are having a very key role in newsrooms that perhaps they didn't have before, or they were kind of, I mean, in my interviews, they describe themselves as nerds. And so I think people treat them like nerds inside the newsroom, so they were a little bit disregarded. But, I mean, nerds fulfill a very kind of useful role inside the newsroom. So it's very hopeful to see how newsrooms are trying to accommodate the resources they already had to address a lot of these challenges that you're mentioning as well. But then the question, and with this we finish, is the role of influencers into shaping this conversation as well.
What to say about influencers? Yeah. Broadly speaking, I guess I would say, I mean, I'm not sure I have really advanced thoughts on this question, but I think what we've seen in the media is that it starts as this kind of, it's cast as this kind of antithetical fight between, like Manichaean fight between the platform versus the media, but it ultimately becomes this thing where actually it's not the media versus the platforms. The large media work with the large platforms, and they both win, and it's the smaller players that kind of get squeezed, right? That's, I think, what we've seen in the media ecosystem. And I think that's kind of, we're seeing traces of that emerge with influencers too, like a kind of a class justice, if you will, in terms of how these content moderation systems work. So, for instance, Facebook has this program that was long secret, is now public, and it's the kind of thing they need to report in the DSA, called X-Check or Cross-Check, which is a system, basically was internal documents leaked saying, you know, we realized our content moderation and detection systems are very inaccurate, and there's a very big likelihood that we're going to be accidentally censoring lots of celebrities and politicians, and that's going to look bad. So let's not apply all these systems to celebrities and politicians. Let's have a special system for them, right? And that's just one example. I have a friend who's an influencer in the Netherlands, or content creator, whatever you want to call it, and he once got suspended from Facebook, and we went through all the appeals channels and nothing happened. But we got a hold of one of their people here in Holland in one phone call, and it's resolved, right? And what the DSA is trying to do is to try to create checks and balances that work for, like, the ordinary man. So another friend of mine, he sued Facebook based on the DSA, or excuse me, he sued Twitter here at the Amsterdam District Court because he was being shadow banned, and he got them to overturn that. So, you know, I think the default tendency of these platforms is only really to help out the powerful, important influencers. Like if Joe Rogan has an issue, I'm sure he has like two full-time staff working on Joe Rogan alone. Same for Donald Trump, right? And for the average person, there's nothing. And, you know, hopefully the DSA is one of these mechanisms that can start to maybe, I'm not super optimistic, create some safeguards for the everyman as well.
Also, maybe to add one more thing, I think the more problematic influences, I'm not sure who exactly you were referring to, but those who, you know, use social media to spread false information or disinformation, or, you know, there was also cases of Russia paying influencers to actually spread propaganda and so on. You know, this is also the way how they're received, and, you know, the way how popular they get is also a symptom of the loss of trust in the media, in actual journalistic sources. So it's often like, oh, we can't believe what the media says anymore. The whole fake news narrative, they're all state-controlled and they all lie to us. So we rather listen to this random person on social media. So I think a lot of the problematic influencers comes also, or are given the room because of that discussion about truth and trust and so on.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, I know that we need to finish, but also related to content, there's a lot of people in platform studies that will argue that the affordances of platforms are, in a way, set up also to favor some type of narratives, particularly disinformation, because if you have a 10-second video that you can only make a 10-second video, it's really easy to say vaccines cause autism or abortion is murder. So it's very easy to make those kind of videos, whereas it is very difficult and very boring if I start explaining to actually, well, there is no evidence to support the claim that vaccines do not cause. So I already lost all of you in those seconds, and so there's a lot of people who will argue that the affordances of particular platforms kind of also incentivize particular type of content. And so this is a challenge because journalists who try to use these platforms, so we also analyze big Dutch newsrooms trying to use TikTok, and they all very much fail because it's not a platform that is posed to in 10 seconds give you like the informative content that you need. And so that is very challenging. With this, thank you very much to all of you for coming today. I think the speakers are available. If you have questions or you want to send them emails, please do so. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to Paddy, and thank you very much to Theresa. And then we'll see you again anytime soon.